In this final video, we're going to look at how to blend panoramas using Lumi 32. And the principles of working with panoramas are identical to normal images. Now, sometimes beginners to exposure blending will try to merge as panoramas the individual exposures that are the same exposures and then try and blend the different exposures. So for example, they'll merge all of the base exposures, then they'll merge all of the darker exposures. So you've got two panoramas and then you layer them in Photoshop and blend them in. The problem with that is Photoshop stitches panoramas differently depending on the information available to it. So it would likely stitch panoramas based on the base exposure differently to how it would on the darker exposure. So it would be much harder to align those layers afterwards and to blend them. Much easier is to just blend the exposures first and then merge them as a panorama. And that's what we're going to do here. So my image of the horseshoe bend contains this darker exposure for the upper sky, a base exposure for mainly the foreground, then a lower exposure, which is for the sky there, and a lower exposure for the foreground. Now for this exposure, we are going to pre-mask. So we're going to create a relatively contrasting scene so that we can generate an easy mask in Lumi 32. So I'm going to bring up the highlights and you see the sky's white. Before we had information in the sky, which meant it would be a little bit harder to create a mask. So if I bring the highlights up, we get rid of that information, and then I bring the shadows down, and you see we're making it much easier to create a mask which targets the sky. For this darker exposure, now by all means, if you want to try editing this before this video, then you can totally do that, and you'll see what challenges we face. But for this darker exposure, we definitely are going to have to match because this horizon here is very dark. So when we try and blend it with this exposure, we're going to end up with some really dark edging. So to fix that, I'm going to increase the exposure of this darker layer, bring the highlights down so we recover the sky, and then bring the shadows up a little bit. Then in this exposure, it's going to be a little bit difficult to pre-mask. You see, we're bringing up the highlights, but it's not overexposing the sky. There's so much information in there. So let's just leave that as it is and see if we can create a mask in Lumi 32. And the good thing about that is we get a bit of variety for how we can create our mask. So it's good practice. So for this, I'm just going to leave it as it is. Then for the darker exposure for that sky, I'm going to do exactly as I did before and just bring up the exposure and then the highlights down, just so we're matching again. Now for this layer, I'm going to bring the clarity slider up because we want to bring information into that sky. And look at how dramatic that is now. We don't really have to do it on this exposure here because we don't contain too much of the sky there, but let's do it anyway just so there's consistency between exposures. Now for this darker exposure, I think we need to darken it a little bit more now because the clarity slider brightened it up. And then if we're happy, we can select all of our exposures and do the usual cleaning. Then I'll hold down Shift and open objects. Now I'm going to manually stack these exposures because I have quite a few of them, so I won't be able to use the stack button in Raya Pro because we want to create two separate windows with our files. So I've got the lower exposure here stacked, and now in a separate window I will stack the higher exposures. And I put the base exposure on the bottom, and that's already done in this layer. So to blend these exposures, let's see if we can create a mask in Lumi 32. So this darker exposure is invisible, but I'm going to make it visible and create a black mask on it because we want to paint in this selection. With Lumi 32, let's see what we can do. I'm going to choose a bright one, and we want a relatively white sky. So that's grey, that's got a lot of information in there, which means we don't have a great mask. If I go to the red channel, is that better? Yeah, that's a big improvement. Green? No, that's not great, and I think blue will be even worse. Yeah, too much information in the sky, so let's try lab mode. And that's done a great job of selecting the sky minus the foreground. Let me bring the smoothness all the way up here. See if we can create more contrast. And I'm going to bring range down so we exclude some of the midtones, and a bit more. And maybe a bit more. And that looks pretty good to me. So I'm going to press select the black mask, a white brush at 100% opacity, press Command and H or Control and H to hide the marching ants, and make a big brush. And then I'm going to paint in this darker exposure. And when we're done, press Command and D or Control and D to deselect the active selection. And there we have it. And if we zoom into the horizon, we'll see that it's relatively smooth, but you see we have some very slight black edging along here. So we might be able to fix that by matching the base exposure. So let's open the base exposure here. Bring down the highlights a little bit. Press OK. We still have some black edging there. So instead, we can just bring down the opacity of this darker exposure, and you see we nullify that black edging a little bit. We don't want to bring it down too much. And then open up Adobe Camera Raw on the darker exposure and reduce the exposure significantly. You see, because we've reduced the opacity of that layer, we've lost some of the sky. If we darken the exposure on that darker layer, we bring some of that sky back. So there's before and after. And if we zoom in 100%, we'll see that the horizon doesn't have any black or white edging. Obviously, if we zoom in really close, we probably will see something, but it's genuinely negligible. So let's zoom out and blend these two exposures. So just as before, I'm going to create a black mask on this darker exposure. Go to Lumi 32, and this will be easier to create a mask because we pre-masked. So by pressing Brights 1, I think that's enough. I've got a good selection of the sky and only a partial selection of some of the foreground. So if I press Select, Control and H or Command and H to hide the marching ants, choose the mask, and then with a big brush, just blend in the darker exposure. Just in case, do it another time to make sure it's all come through. Press Command and D or Control and D to deselect the active selection, and there we go. And again, zooming into 100%, you can see we don't have any black edging or anything like that. So now I need to stitch these two layers. I'm going to go to File, Save As, and I'm going to save this as Lower. And press OK. Then with the next exposure, I'm going to go to File, Save As again, and this time we're going to call it Upper. Now I've just remembered that Photoshop won't stitch smart objects, so we should go to Layer, Flatten Image, and save this again, but this time we'll call it Upper 1 and Lower 1, so that we don't get rid of the blended workflow that we've been working on. We can go back to those in the future if we want. So I'm going to flatten the image again, File, Save As, Lower 1. So to blend these exposures, we're going to go to File, Automate, Photo Merge, and choose Auto, and add Open Files. We're also going to choose Geometric Distortion Correction because I'm shooting with a really wide angle lens here. So I'm going to press OK, and we're probably going to come out with something with a lot of distortion here. So that's not too bad a job. So I'm going to close these windows because we don't need them open anymore. I'm going to press Layer and Merge Visible. Now clearly we want to correct this distortion, so let's go to Filter and Adaptive Wide Angle. Now we want to scale out a little bit so we can see the whole image. So I'm just reducing that quite a bit, let's say to around 85-ish. And we certainly don't want to lose any of our foreground when we do this distortion. So I'm going to select here across the horizon and meet it at the other side. So I'm left clicking it and dragging my cursor all the way to the other side, and then I let go. And that flattens the horizon for us. Now there's distortion down here as well. So I do exactly the same thing down there. Now that's flattened the foreground, and why not do the sky as well? And there we go, that's a much better image. I think there's probably a little bit of distortion around here. You see it's bending a little bit in this rock, so let's fix that. And overall I think that's okay. So I'm going to scale up to make sure it covers most of this canvas, and then I can press OK. And then with the crop tool, I will crop into the frame so we can get as much of the photo as possible in the frame here. Then we want this canyon to be right in the center here. So I think that's all right. I'm going to press OK. Then I'm going to drop the center of the sky a little bit because we don't need it to be that high. Now I'm going to hold down Control and T or Command and T, and then right click on the image to choose Distort. And I'm going to bring out that corner there and press OK again. Then with the ruler, I'm just going to check the horizon. Now it's hard to know what's classed as straight here because this isn't a flat horizon naturally. As you can see, there are a lot of hills. So I think that's all right. But why don't we do that again? Press Distort and bring up this side a little bit just to make sure it doesn't look strange. And then I'm going to zoom in. And now looking at this, I think I want to crop out a little bit more actually because the composition seems a little bit too tight for me. So let's move these out a little bit more. Make the composition less square. And we can get as much information in this frame as possible. Maybe bring the top up a tiny bit. Press OK. And just as we did before, Command and T or Control and T and Distort. And we just bring out these bottom sliders a little bit. And this one a tiny bit too. Then we can bring this top bit up a little bit as well because I think this in the middle here is a little bit too flat. And then press OK. And then we can zoom in. So with that, we've blended and stitched this panorama, and you can see it's often not an easy process to do. And in fact, I've missed a tiny bit in this bottom right hand corner. So let me fix it. Just zoom out it again. You can see a little bit of white down here. Choose Distort, pull that out a tiny bit. You've got to get it right. So as you can see, these things can be a little bit tricky, especially when shooting with the really wide angle lens. So what do we do now? Well, before we move forward, let me talk about one thing. You'll remember in the base exposure, the lower base exposure, I pre-masked. So I made the sky really white and darkened the foreground. But after I blended exposures, I didn't go back into Adobe Camera Raw and fix that pre-mask. So I didn't move the settings back to their default settings, which is what I would normally do. The reason I didn't do that here is because the final blend looked absolutely fine. So there wasn't any need to change it. But if the blend didn't look fine, then I probably would have put all of the sliders back to default. So to continue with this workflow, first things first, we got to deepen this sky, make it more impactful. So I'm going to create a curves layer. And I'm going to bring down the contrast in that sky. Really make it strong. Now, if you find the color's gone a little bit oversaturated, we can change the blend mode of that layer to luminosity. So now we're just affecting the luminosity values and not the saturation. So with the mask of that layer selected, with a big brush and a black foreground, I'm going to blend out the foreground because that's a little bit too strong. So there we go. There's before and after. It's all right if it's on the horizon a little bit. Now I'm going to do a general contrast adjustment with a levels layer where I really darken the scene and soften the shadows. And for me, this adds a lot of mood. But I do understand that it's personal taste as well, so a lot of people might not like this. Bring up the brightness a tiny bit, and here I'm going to mask out the sky of that contrast adjustment. So what I'm looking to do here is darken the midtones, soften the shadows, but also bring some of the upper midtones along so that they're a little bit brighter. So you see the foreground along here. is brightening up a little bit. And there's the before and after. Now, why don't we create a little bit of local contrast here right in front of us in this canyon? To do that, we'll do exactly what we did before, where we press Control Shift Alt and E to merge all these layers, or we can go to the Filters and Finish panel in Raya Pro and choose Detail Enhance. And when this surface blur dialog opens, we press OK. Then we create a black mask on our Detail Enhance layer. Now, if you don't have Raya Pro, remember we press Control Shift Alt and E, then we press Control and J or Command and J to duplicate that layer. We change the blend mode of that layer to Vivid Light. We press Control and I or Command and I to invert that layer. Then we group these two and change the blend mode of the group to Overlay. And with this inverted layer selected, we go to Filter, Blur, Surface Blur. And then with those settings, we just press OK. With that done, obviously it's far too strong and we want to make a more targeted adjustment. So we create a black mask on that group with a white brush. I'm going to paint right in the middle here. You see, we're bringing out some real detail there. And how about in this foreground too? Obviously, we're going to reduce the opacity a little bit here. Now, we don't necessarily want to do the other canyons because that might be a little bit distracting, but we might be able to do it a little bit and it might make a decent difference. So I've reduced my brush opacity to 40% and I'm just painting in those areas gently. I'm avoiding the sky, I'm just painting in those ridges. So with that done, let's reduce our opacity until the changes look more natural. So I'm at about 39% there. And I can probably increase that a bit more actually. Let's say to 47. Yeah, that is better. Maybe a little bit more. Let's say 57. I think that's perhaps a little bit strong. So a tiny bit of a reduction to 51%. Yeah, that's good. Now let's do a little bit of a vignette. The same vignettes I've done throughout. Bring down my upper midtone with a curve layer. Bring up my shadows. Control and I or Command and I. We want to paint that in to the top of the sky here. We also want to paint it here to the right and to the left around there because those areas are a bit distracting. And down here in the corner, not on the brighter part of the rock, just on the rock that's closest to us. And that adds a little bit of depth there. So watch before and after. Now, if that's a little bit too strong, we can reduce the opacity of that layer. Then we can open up another curves layer, bring that up, and invert the mask. Then with a white brush again, we can paint in this area here in the center, in the sun too, so the band around the horizon, we can make that strong, and here in the rocks in the foreground. And again, I'll reduce the opacity a little bit if it looks a bit strange. Select both of these layers, press Ctrl and J or Command and G to see before and after. So there's before and there's after. So we're just pushing the viewer towards these foreground rocks and this big canyon ridge in the midground. So again, there's before and after. And to finish, I can open one more levels layer just to check that contrast is okay. Perhaps we can bring the blacks along a little bit, just to give it a little bit more contrast. And I think that works well. So here's before all those changes, and there's after. And that's it for the Mastering Lumi 32 course. I hope you found it useful, and I hope you continue to shoot and create beautiful images using Lumi 32. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.